In the year 31 BCE, the young Octavian had defeated his enemy and rival Mark Antony and become master of the Roman world. At the Battle of Actium, he had decisively routed Antony's fleet. Antony's lover and ally, the Egyptian queen Cleopatra, having retreated with her fleet from the battlefield and leaving the doomed Antony to his fate, soon after quietly killed herself, some say with the bite of an asp, and Octavian, now in possession of the fabled riches of Egypt, and with unrivaled control of the Senate at Rome, took the helm as the most powerful man in the ancient Mediterranean. He would now become an emperor, Rome's first, and change his name to Augustus, meaning revered or auspicious, the august, and as emperor, he would change the face of Rome forever. In that year of transcendence and decisive victory, he minted a coin to announce his arrival and success. Coins travelled far and wide in a world before mass media and were an effective method of propagating a message. So what do you imagine he depicted on that coin? What message did he send? Gratitude to the gods who had granted him such divine favour, perhaps? Or maybe something evoking the famous battle, a conquering ship or a winged victory laying a laurel wreath on the august head, a personified Egypt in shackles cowering in his shadow, or maybe the man himself standing triumphant with his foot on the globe. Well, in fact, what he minted was this: a coin displaying a sort of stump with a crossbar that looks like truncated arms. The cruciform shape looks something like a scarecrow, but a scarecrow made of stone, and, bizarrely, one that is sometimes depicted with Augustus's face attached. It sits on a scattering pile of squiggles which represent a thunderbolt, and on either side of that stump are the words Imp Caesar, Imperator Kaiser, announcing the power in Augustus's name. Imperator was how troops would hail their victorious general, and although he didn't know it at the time, this would now become the title of the new imperial office. It is the origin of the English word emperor. But that is it. A fairly ignominious-looking coin for such a monumental and empire-changing event. So what on earth is this image, and why, of all the myriad things he could have chosen to wrap his name around, did Augustus choose this? The short answer is that this is a boundary stone, but a special one, representing the god Terminus, the Roman god of boundaries. That's what you'll read in textbooks. However, to truly understand the power of this iconography and how it speaks to the power undergirding Rome, we need to understand who this god really was and the nature of his divinity. So in this episode, we enter the realm of Terminus, the unyielding. To step into the world of Terminus is to step into something far older than Rome itself. At least in myth, but in practice too. Here is a sacred logic from very early times, ostensibly predating Rome, but certainly predating the mature city, its conquests, its empire, and even the great temples of the Capitoline Hill. The Capitoline, so familiar as the superlative of Rome's 7 hills, was Rome's Axis Mundi, Rome's holy mountain, as one scholar has dubbed it. The highest, the greatest, and fitting home for the king of the gods himself, Jupiter Optimus Maximus, best and greatest. It was Rome's own Olympus, the divine seat, not sequestered away in a mountain range, nor even, as was true of the Greek Zeus, in sanctuaries outside city walls beyond specific allegiances. Zeus was pan-Hellenic, but Jupiter's allegiances were clear. He was the god of Rome, par excellence, and he inhabited the hill at the very heart of his city. He was the god of empire. Ovid describes him sitting in his great temple, surveying all Rome's dominions from that sacred center. It seems like a timeless image, something so integral to Rome's identity and self-presentation, seems to be forged into the very bones of the place. Yet there are cracks. What Virgil tells us in the Aeneid, his great epic of Roman myth history, is that some gods had been up there on the Capitoline before Rome even existed, before Romulus, before the first stones of the city's walls were ever laid. He describes the Trojan hero Aeneas arriving finally after long travails at the site of future Rome. It is modestly inhabited at that time by a Greek settlement ruled by the good but exiled king Evander, who takes them on a tour. The thrill of this tour for Virgil's contemporary audience was his conjuring of the primordial city, in which they could compare spots Evander points out in the rustic wilderness with the grandeur they know will replace it. Listen to what he says about the Capitoline. From here, Evander leads them to the Tarpeian seat and the Capitoline, now golden, once bristling with wild thickets. Even then the dread of the place struck fear into the trembling rustics. Even then they trembled at the forest and the rocky crag. This grove, this hill with its leafy summit, he said, is inhabited by a god. Which god is uncertain. The Arcadians believe they have seen Jupiter himself, when he would often shake his darkening aegis in his right hand and summon the storm clouds. So I was taught quite straightforwardly that this passage was a foreshadowing of Jupiter and the future Virgil's audience already knew and felt inevitable. And in that reading, the point was to anticipate the present and to show that the hill had always been the sacred domain of Jupiter, even before people knew his actual name. Virgil puts this rough, shady woodland in his audience's mind to contrast starkly with the Augustan reality, the height of civilization, the Capitoline itself, restored or rebuilt, paved in shining marbles, gilt and glinting in the sun. It's golden now, he says, but dark then, stressing the difference. Now we can agree with that idea at face value. It's the obvious reading. However, in keeping with this series, we might think about it rather differently. Of course, Virgil's overriding purpose was to glorify Rome, Jupiter, and by extension Augustus, for whom this epic poem was written. However, by describing the Capitoline as a holy place long prior to the recognition of Jupiter as its ruling deity, he tacitly acknowledges that the familiar Capitoline of triumphal temples and imperial processions was built over a deeper, older stratum of religious history. By this reading, instead of just prefiguring Jupiter and anticipating the present of Virgil's audience in Augustan Rome, this ambiguous divine presence creates space for Rome's deep past. Perhaps we're even glimpsing that in the reverence and trembling fear with which Virgil describes the rustics beholding the forest and rocky crag. This could merely be a description of the Capitoline in its wild state, but couldn't it also nod to the fundamental animism of early Roman religion, by which trees and rocks could be divine in their own right? At any rate, beyond acknowledging old religious beliefs and practices, maintaining ambiguity about which god precisely was looming in that wilderness allows for and accommodates the presence of other ancient gods residing there. As you've probably already guessed, the hill was associated with other deities, not only Juno and Minerva, who accompanied Jupiter's cult up there and who were worshipped together as the Capitoline Triad, but other, very antique gods whose origins retreated into the mists of history, but who were still remembered and still revered. And, as you might also have guessed, Terminus was one of those deities. A crucial one. The world of sacred rocks, contested territory, and divine accommodations just described was very much his domain. In Latin, Terminus is simultaneously the word for a boundary stone and the boundary god. In that animistic way of things, it's not that the stones belonged to the deity who presided over them, so much as they were the deity, or he, in essence, was them. So in his poem, The Fasti, Ovid hails Terminus like this: O Terminus, whether thou art a stone or stump buried in the field, thou too hast been deified from days of yore. Ovid acknowledges in this way both the great antiquity of the god and his rudimentary form. Roman society and Roman religion at large had a preoccupation with boundaries and transitions. The fraught and charged edges of things are a recurring theme, as we shall see, that sometimes borders on the obsessive. We've already seen an example of this with Mata Matuta in the previous episode as the goddess of daybreak, marking the transition into day, but also guiding other life changes and transitions. The importance of Terminus to early rustic society is clear. The boundaries he guarded were pragmatic and palpable. Boundary markers were the stones that mapped out the terrain and defined and divided individual properties. They marked where one person's land ended and another's began, and for people eking out their existence from the land, what lay within that dividing line was your whole livelihood. The security of your boundaries was therefore paramount. To prevent the intolerable outrage of a neighbour sneakily moving the boundary stones out and expanding his plot by encroaching upon your own, Terminus embodied and sanctified those boundaries. He made them immovable, inviolable, and to trespass against them was to trespass not only against your neighbour, but against the god himself. It was also against the law. Cicero describes law itself as a form of boundary, reflecting the divine order that governs human affairs. Indeed, the 12 Tables, Rome's venerable legislation from the 5th century BCE, which informed legal proceedings for the longue durée of the Roman Empire, were explicit about the legal enforcement of boundary sanctity and set harsh penalties for tampering with boundary stones, enshrining the sacred nature of Terminus's function in the Roman legal tradition. The fundamental character of this deity then was his fixity, his permanence, and his inviolability. His presence on the Capitoline was so long held and so entrenched that it came with a legend of its own. It was said that when the great temple to Jupiter was in the early stages of construction in the early 6th century, and its foundations were just being laid, it was necessary first to move and clear away the shrines and temples of the gods already occupying the site, which is already a small but significant detail. Of course, divine permission was sought to do this, and all the proper rituals were followed to ensure no reprisals from angry gods followed, and permission was accordingly granted, and one by one the gods all made their way for the great Sky Father, except one, Terminus, true to his nature, would not budge. So steadfast and unyielding was the spirit of the boundary god that Terminus could not by any persuasion be moved. The Roman historian Livy tells us that this was interpreted as an omen. His refusal to yield was understood as a divine guarantee that Rome itself would be eternal. Rome, like Terminus, would never be displaced. And so the temple builders, and Jupiter, had no choice but to accept this obstacle to their floor plans, and they accommodated Terminus by incorporating him within the great temple, in the very cella of the temple. The cella is the main room, the holy of holies, where Jupiter's cult statue would have sat. It's an astonishing tale when you think about it. Jupiter was not a god to be trifled with, and usually he brooked no opposition. But it wasn't only a tale, because it spoke to the architectural reality that indeed Terminus was there for all to see, wedged into Jupiter's temple. Moreover, accommodating Terminus's requirements to sit under the open sky in full view of the stars, a hole needed to be cut into the roof, which was maintained through all the centuries of temple renovations. So the story, for all its legendary qualities, had some sort of real historical accommodation at its heart. It was pitched as a good omen and remembered as a happy outcome, but in the clearing out of the shrines and the moving of old deities elsewhere, we do get a strong glimpse of the original Capitoline as something other than the eternal and unquestioned abode of Jupiter Optimus Maximus. The presence of Terminus in Jupiter's temple is an act of survival suggestive of an older power that even Jupiter himself could not overrule. Terminus was an old stalwart in the manner Romans admired. Ovid relates that he was a peaceable god in the vein of good fences make good neighbours. He recites how people would pray to him, saying, "O Terminus, you mark the limits of people, cities, and vast kingdoms. Without you, every field would be racked with dispute. You have no ambition, nor can you be corrupted by gold. You keep the entrusted lands with rightful faith." In that spirit, neighbours either side of a boundary would gather once a year on February the 23rd for the god's annual festival, the Terminalia. On this day they would celebrate, sacrifice a lamb and drench the boundary stones in its blood and garland them. Offerings were made of corn, wine, and honeycombs, and the gathering would feast together and sing. These rustic and neighbourly shindigs notwithstanding, in the context of the city and the empire it accumulated, Terminus played a vital role in maintaining more politically significant boundaries. Chief among these was the Pomerium, which was the sacred perimeter, the city walls of Rome. Legend tells us that from the very first act of the city's foundation, when Romulus, Rome's first king, dug the first trench for the Pomerium, Rome was defined by the careful articulation of what was inside and what was outside. It was a serious matter from the start. Romulus's twin brother Remus, according to some versions of the story, leapt over the nascent city's walls in mockery. It was a fatal act. Livy recounts that Romulus, in response, struck his brother down, stating that this would be the fate of anyone who dared violate Rome's sacred limits. His death was a warning to all. This, like all Rome's boundaries, was not arbitrary but divine, and to transgress them was to invite ruin. The Pomerium as a sacred boundary was deeply connected to Terminus. It was not a defensive boundary in the sense of a fortified wall, but rather in the sense of a sacred line, which was taken very seriously. For example, it delineated the extent of military command. A general had his powers, his imperium, in the field outside the city, but he was mandated to leave it at the city gates alongside his arms. On the offensive, there was a curious consideration for enemy boundaries too. Numa Pompilius, Rome's legendary second king, traditionally credited with shaping the city's religious institutions, was said to have introduced a number of religious regulations that codified the sanctity of space and limits. Among these were the Fetiales, a priestly college responsible for Rome's diplomatic and war-making procedures, particularly in relation to treaties and the declaration of war. The fetial rituals they presided over are a crucial aspect of Roman history, especially concerning sacred boundaries. These priests were responsible for declaring war and making treaties, ensuring that such actions were divinely sanctioned. In these rituals, the Pater Patratus, who was the chief priest, would carry a blood-smeared spear, and upon reaching the enemy's territory would hurl it across the boundary, heralding that war had officially been announced. However, as the empire expanded and Rome had to declare war on distant territories, the ritual for declaring war was adapted so that the Fetiales didn't need to actually be present at these far-flung borders. Instead, a piece of land was symbolically designated as enemy territory within Rome itself. This land was located in front of the Temple of Bellona, a goddess of war, and a column known as the Columna Bellica was erected there. A spear was then thrown over this column to signify that war had been declared. So, although a kind of cheat code or a workaround for the process, this adaptation tells us a lot about the mindset behind it. It wasn't empty proceduralism. It was a deep-seated concern about the sanctity of boundaries and the fear of violating them without divine approval. So even by proxy, borders still had to be ritually observed, attended properly, and transgressed only with all due attention to the gods. This is why Terminus is in some ways a manifestation of the Roman worldview. In terms of law, duty, power, and cosmic order, he's the embodiment of the order so fundamental to Rome's endurance. He was the stone at the heart of it, holding the whole thing down. Far more than a god of boundary stones, he was the god of Rome's permanence itself. At this point, we can return to the coin with which we started and think again, with a deeper understanding now, about why at his moment of triumph, Augustus would choose this image, this god, over all others. No doubt you can already see how much more of a statement this is than some dull affirmation of Rome's borders, as is often said. Indeed, from the Roman perspective, they didn't really have borders. The world was theirs. What Virgil famously called imperium sine fine, empire without limits, or as Ovid says in his praise of Terminus, the land of other nations has a fixed boundary. The circuit of Rome is the circuit of the whole world. So if you are seeing Terminus narrowly as a boundary god, then the coin is a strange choice and a bit nonsensical. But it isn't at all like so much of what Augustus did. This was a genius masterstroke of propaganda. Let's break it down. Yes, victory was his at Actium. He had defeated Antony and Cleopatra and annexed Egypt. But what was it all in aid of? In truth, it was a brutal civil war between two ambitious, talented, and power-hungry men. But that's hardly a good spin. Antony was older, more experienced, and had loyal troops behind him, but he had made a fatal error. He had left the capital. That left Octavian, the soon-to-be Augustus, in control of the narrative. Antony's allegiance with the Egyptian queen allowed Augustus to spin the war as one against a foreign foe, and a woman at that. And Antony, far from Rome and in the rapture of the riches and power of Egypt, if not its famous queen, grew more and more distant from the capital, more dangerously disconnected from his roots, less Roman, more Oriental. Octavian capitalized on this, portraying Antony not only as a traitor to Roman traditions, but a traitor to Rome itself. The rumor circulated that if Antony won the war, he would move the capital altogether from Rome to Alexandria. You can imagine the hysteria. In that climate, Octavian fueled the fires by making the outrageous move of publicizing Antony's will, which he justified as being a matter of national security. The will revealed Antony's desire to be buried in Alexandria alongside Cleopatra. Nobody thought it was romantic. The horror was palpable and confirmed all suspicions about Antony's intention to shift the imperial center from Rome. Octavian, in this narrative, was there to save the day. And the rest is history. In this light, after his decisive victory, Terminus, the unyielding, the god who would not budge, suddenly becomes an extremely pointed choice of imagery. What was at stake was the very question about where the empire's center of power lay, and Terminus was an explicit statement of Roman immovability, inviolability in the face of that existential challenge, resting on the thunderbolt of Rome. So when Augustus stamped his name, Imperator Caesar, around the stone of Terminus, he was making a bold statement. Power had been contested. Borders had been redrawn. Rome's enemies may come, but its center was steadfast and would hold. And who ensured that? Who channeled the will of Jupiter himself? That was no god. That was Augustus. The myth, the city, the god, and the man are all woven together in a single image on this coin. It's a statement about power, permanence, and the inevitable seeming trajectory now of Augustus's rule. What had been a myth about a god refusing to budge becomes here a reality about an empire refusing to shift its center, and in the end about the man who held that center, who held it down, and who would not step down from power in the manner of the consuls of old. Instead, commanding a new superlative role at the head of state, Augustus, like Terminus, would not budge, and for the rest of its history, Rome would have an emperor.